Welcome to the Catbird Quilts. I'm Kathy Martin. Today's video is how I make my quilt labels. And it's changed a lot since I started. And so, of course, I have a lot to say about it. Several of you, like three of you have asked me about my quilt labels. I rarely show them on camera, in part because I do try to protect the privacy of my friends and family here on YouTube. And also it's kind of personal. So, I have never known whether my friends and family really want all that sweetness right out there on the internet for everyone to see. But I have lots of opinions, of course, about quilt labels. And so I thought I'd share those with you today. Well, examples and the opinions and how I do them. This is not an exhaustive quilt label tutorial. There are as many ways to do quilt labels as there are quilters. And some of them are beautiful, professionally printed. Some, like mine, are handwritten, usually last minute and stitched in a hurry, and not always with quality in mind. It's more like, I love this person and I want this to have a label. So first I want to show you and tell you about when I started. I made my first quilt in part using Melanie K. Ham's YouTube videos. And when it got to the end and she talked about quilt labels, I listened, maybe not carefully, but okay, it has to have a label. And didn't really look closely at how she did her label. I just okay, I need to do a label. And so having not been a quilter before that, when I hear label, I think of garment labels. So like as small a piece of fabric as possible with just the bare minimum of information that it needs to have. And so I want to show you that, my very first quilt label, and maybe we can have a laugh about that. Before I put this quilt label on, I was told by many people and also YouTube that you're supposed to name your quilt. And so I named this quilt. Well, my sister actually named this quilt. When she saw it, she said, "Oh, it looks like sunshine in a blue cloud sky." So I actually renamed it Sunshine in a Blue Sky with Clouds, because it's all blue and white and gray shirts. And then there's a centerpiece that's yellow and orange. If you want to see that quilt, this whole quilt up close, we have a video about my first quilt. So you can totally watch that if you are interested in the details. But the quilt label itself, it needs a title, it needs a date, and it needs your name. And so that's what I put on it. Sunshine in a Blue Sky with Clouds. First quilt, July 2021, Kathy Martin. There it is. And it's funny to me because I don't know if you can tell, it's very small. It's very small. And I wrote in tiny little writing. And I'll talk about pens that I use in just a few minutes. The only thing I really knew was that it needed to not have any rough edges because, they'll fray. And so I folded a piece of fabric over and then I folded it in half and then folded the sides under and stitched that down and wrote on it and stitched it on. And you know what? It is a perfectly good quilt label. It's funny to me now because it's just so little. I look at this and I see this C in the clouds, which is very much my experience with quilt labels. I'll write it out and then one letter isn't right, which actually, many of them aren't the way that I want them, but there'll be one in particular that I really don't like. And I go back with my pen to fix it. And of course it makes it darker and more ragged on the edge. And then I'm like, But now I look at that and I'm not irritated at that C right there. It makes me laugh, which is the beauty of time and loving something. So I love this quilt. I use it all the time. And I just feel proud and happy. And that imperfection in this label and how little it is actually a source of enjoyment for me now, as opposed to like, horror that I've like done it badly. If you like this, by the way, and this is the literal start of the journey, really all I did was fold a piece of fabric in half. And then I tucked under the ends, stitched those down, and then wrote on it and stitched it into my binding. Now, this is a thing for me. I don't know if you have this experience, if you are a quilter or if you've been quilting for a long time. By the time I get a quilt quilted or get it back from the long arm quilter, I am ready to get the binding on and call it a day. So usually I get the binding on, I'm like, I'm done. Oh, dang. Now I need to do a quilt label, even if I know what I want the quilt label to say. So very often I do not think about the quilt label until the binding is done. And I really want to work on that and start putting my quilt labels on before I bind them, because I do really like the way that it looks when it's kind of nested in the binding. And the binding also helps hold it down, which is just a bonus. So this was my starting place. And nothing special. And then from here, I just cut a square. I believe I interfaced it, maybe turned it inside out so it wouldn't have any raw edges. It's a little bit bigger. We'll show you a picture of that. And then did stitches like binding just to kind of hide it, just to tack it down. And it worked fine. I mean, there's absolutely nothing wrong with that quilt label either. But as I started quilting more and giving quilts away as gifts, I thought maybe I wanted something a little more polished. And so I'm going to show you that next. But first, let's talk about pins and fabric. So when I first started, I looked for advice on how to do quilt labels. A lot of people recommend the Pigma Micron. It does really work well on fabric. Now, I will say that thankfully I practiced on some fabric before I made my quilt label. I have been surprised. I was surprised. I continue to be surprised what pen ink does in fabric, and it depends on the fabric. So initially, as I started and I was using shirts almost exclusively, not totally, but a lot of my white background and white fabrics came from shirts. I learned really quickly that certain shirts absorb the ink really well, and some of them absorb them so much that it just bleeds everywhere. And some of them, it's a whole wealth of experience just with each shirt. So I'm going to show you that first. This is a very thin shirt, and it is, you can see it's very thin. I'm going to put it on top of another piece of fabric. And when I use this pen, I have to really press down to get the ink in it. This is one that does not bleed a lot. And I do feel like I have to go over what I have written to make it really solid enough where it's going to be visible and hold the ink. And as you can see, as it's continuing to sit here, it's bleeding ever so slightly, or, maybe a lot. I do use the pen and press it with an iron to heat set it. And I've done so many labels with this pen with varying degrees of success. I can get a nice clean line. Sometimes I have to go over it. Anytime I go over it, I feel like I introduce problems with my label and my handwriting. I also have this one. This is Writer, Writer by Zig. It has two sides. It has a thin side, and then it has a fat side. which you can tell I have used enough that is starting to not have a lot of ink. I don't really like the fat side. I've used it for 1,000 other things, not really for labels. So I rarely use the thick side, but you can see just with that zig pen, the zig writer, I did not have to go over those same letters twice like I did with the Micron on this same piece of fabric. To me, this one works just a little bit better. It is a little clearer. I can go back over it, but it seems to connect with the fabric a little bit better as opposed to the Pigma Micron. I recently was going to make a quilt label and I just didn't like it. Like everything that I wrote, I thought it looked bad. So I got my Faber-Castell Pit Artist pen brush. Now I have done a whole video about making your own fabric with, well, not making the fabric, making your own patterns on fabric with these markers. And so I know they work. I know they wash up and you don't lose a lot of ink because I use them in my older daughter's graduation quilt. And I actually had her take a picture of the little frog emojis that I made. And that's been 3 years ago and it's holding strong, does not show any real significant signs of fading. So recently I pulled this pen out and just wrote on some fabric and was like, why have I not been using this before now? It just, I don't know, it was so much easier to me because it has a brush tip. I don't know if you can see that. So you can do like a wide line or a narrow line. So it gives I think it gives handwriting a little bit more flair. So if I wanted to do it cursive, I could do cursive, but it seemed to work better to me. And I can do a little bit more with my actual handwriting. I actually used this on a recent quilt label for a comfort quilt. I think I'm just going to make that comfort quilt like 8 million times. I did that, set it, washed it. It came out just exactly the same. So I think I might be using these brush pens a lot more often than I have. So this may be the next direction that my quilt labels go. There's lots of recommendations out there. I'm sure there's whole videos on what kind of pens to use for your quilt labels, but these are the 3 that I have used with varying degrees of success. So now let me show you what the next step in my quilt label journey was. This is my younger daughter's graduation quilt back from the long armor, and I'm going to be putting a quilt label on it. And I wanted to do a technique that I have actually done a couple of years ago. Let me show you that picture first. It is for our, almost adoptive son's son baby quilt. And so Wells Quilt was a linen, white, blue, and tan meadowlark quilt, and I loved it and wanted something really special, so I put a corner label on it. Now, the thing about corner labels, well, there's a lot of things about corner labels. I love them because they look really clean and orderly and thoughtful. You do have to get it all worked out before you ever put your binding on because it nests underneath the binding. To that end, that's why I want to do that on my younger daughter's quilt because she likes those fine details and things to be together and orderly, as you can tell by the checkerboard quilt. So this particular quilt has a black backing on it. This is speckled by Ruby Star Society. Rashida Coleman Hale, I think is her name. And what I hope to do is attach this label to the corner, but it needs to have something on this edge. Well, I guess it doesn't need to, but it looks very polished and finished. And so what that looks like is just like this when it's finished. And so that becomes, the raw edge gets sewn down with its own little baby binding. And then the binding comes along and covers up these raw edges. And then you have all of this to put your label. So let me show you how to do that and some things to think about when you do that corner label if you haven't ever done it before. So the corner label is especially tricky because you have to think through how your writing is going to go in the corner. When you have just a square or a rectangle, it's just like writing on a note card. For example, it just makes sense. It's like you leave a little bit of margin at the top, you leave a little bit of margin on the side, and you leave a little bit of margin in the bottom. And maybe even you just write your text and then you go back and trim it down to the right size. Triangle, a little bit harder. So I wanted to show you some techniques that I use to help me. And the first is this very highly used lined Post-it. Now you could do this with filler paper. Do they even call that filler paper anymore? Lined, ruled paper. I happen to have this at work and looked at that and thought, oh, I think that would show up through fabric. So I actually took a ruler and a Sharpie marker and darkened in all of the lines so that I could, have a guide. The great thing about having it as a Post-it, which I've used mine so much, it hardly sticks anymore. Time for a new one. But you can basically stick it down to your counter or sewing table or kitchen table and put your fabric down. And now you have a guide. And this is the tricky triangle situation. So you have to leave enough on the edges for the binding and a margin. And then you have to recognize where your little binding is going to come on that edge and leave a margin. So it's a little bit more challenging to visualize. So in this situation, what I would probably do, and this is why I have my little graph paper here, and of course it does have lines, and I can see it. I don't know if you can or not, but you kind of practice how you want. So like in this situation, here's my triangle. That is not a good line. So this is the landscape I have to work with. I'm going to give myself that's my seam allowance roughly. This is what I have to work with. And then I can put my label. So made with love for Paul by Kathy, October 2024. So whatever you want your label to say, and the Quilt Police say you need to have at least your name and the date, and then whatever quilt you want to call it. So Quilty Stars. This is that situation where, and I've done many of these where I write it, I'm like, no. And then I write it again, no. And then I write on paper, no. It's the writing happy birthday on a cake that you've baked and not understood text kerning or margins, or how it's the spatial relations thing that continues to stymie me. I'll write happy birth, and then, the DAY is like half of the size of happy birthday because I run out of space. So this is the time to figure out what your spacing is. So if I was going to do that again, I would probably scoop my M back. I would start, over here, and my made would start out there and then sort it out. So I do that. I practice on a piece of paper. Usually I just use plain paper. I put it over my nice lined Post-it and get a sense of where I want that to be. And then when it's time for me to do it for real, on my fabric, I at least have it in my favor where I need to start and where the line should end and how many lines there are going to be. And that seems to work for me. I will say, even doing multiple drafts and then, having, okay, it's good. It's good. We're good. It's good. Then often I'll go in and cut 2 or 3 more of these sizes because it just doesn't seem to come together the first time. So then I do this nifty trick. I use my handy dandy painter's tape, and I just tape it down to whatever surface I have. In this case, I can use my tape also as my margin. So I have a sense of, okay, don't go too close to the edge. Now I've got that a little more sturdy, and I don't know if you noticed when I was writing on that other fabric, I was holding the fabric, trying to stretch it so that it would stay flat on the surface. Because as you write on fabric, very often, it will crawl. Now that this is taped down and secure, I can turn in a way that it's comfortable for my hand and writing. So now I can do what I want to do here. So graduation quilt made with love by Mom. And then I can put for my daughter's name and then the date. And so that helps secure it and gives me, it's like security and security. It stabilizes my fabric piece so it doesn't get crawly up under the pen. And I have the security of having ruled lines that keep my handwriting nice and straight, so I don't go back and go, ooh, what happened there? If you were interested in how to do this edge apart from the writing, let me show you that. So I started out with a piece of fabric that I'm going to use. In the case of my daughter's quilt, I'm going to use that same black speckled fabric. And I would use 1.5 inches piece of fabric, at least the length of that, of the hypotenuse of this triangle. So the long side. So you fold it in half and press that down. And then fold the edge to the center, just like this. Press that down. Do the other side. Press that down. And then when they get folded together, it makes that right there. So you can see if I open this up. So there, this was the center fold. And then here's the 2 edges folded in and pressed. And now what I would do is pin or clip this down. So I'm just lining up that long edge along the center fold. And then I would clip or pin that all along this edge. And then because I used 1.5 inches of my piece, I can just follow my 1/4 inch seam allowance and it will get all of that picked up pretty close to the edge. You could do it even smaller. I have found that my top stitching leaves a lot to be desired. When I do that, I'm like, oh, it just feels like it looks like waves on the ocean. So what I would do in this situation is I would use a similar colored thread to my binding. I almost said cutting board. You can tell I cooked last night. You can see it's just slightly more than 1/4 inch. So that 1/4 inch seam line will leave a nice little edge, a nice smooth edge. And again, if you wanted to just do this as 1 inch rather than 1.5 inches, it won't give you quite as much margin, but your seam would be right along the edge of that 1/4 inch seam line. And that's how you can do it. Another option, if you don't want to have to go to the trouble of doing the little binding on your quilt label, is to simply fold your fabric in half, and that will give you a closed edge. Let me show you that. Imagine this is a square. This one would obviously be much bigger. And you just fold it in half and press that down. And now you have that fold that is the closed edge and no raw threads. These raw threads will be up under the binding of the quilt, just like this. And then you just have that as your edge. The cool thing about a corner pocket is it kind of makes it where you can hang it on a hook. Not that anybody needs to be hanging a quilt on a hook. And it will probably stretch out the quilt label, but it's just kind of nice. You know, it's like, oh, look, we could just hang this up. So I really like that. I like the way that looks. Again, we can show you a picture of the finished corner quilt label piece. I don't know what it is about quilt label together. Those words just, I don't know, they just feel like they don't go together. And so I did that for quite a few quilts. I really like it. I think it does look really clean and neat and finished. It has that polished look about it. But then I got busy making quilts and went back to thinking of the label as the last thing. Now what I do is I just get a piece of fabric that I like. And again, let's talk about that briefly. I wanted to mention, again, the fabrics that you use for your quilt labels. What I have found to be true is that shirts are actually terrible for quilt labels unless they are just very stiff and very smooth, which is kind of hard to find in a shirt. I mean, the whole deal is that they're really, really soft. So what I have discovered to be true is that quilting cottons are great, and the back side of them are even better. So in this case, this is the front side of this quilting cotton. This is the front side. I'm probably going to use this one for that checkerboard graduation quilt. If I turn it over, it's a little smoother because it doesn't have the print on it, but it still has the feel of that print. And it seems to take the ink really well. You notice that's what I did on this one. And that pen just wrote beautifully, as opposed to this very thin piece that you saw me write on. And the longer the ink was there, the more that it bled. So this is a sheet. This is a quilting cotton. This may work beautifully or not, but the quilting cotton generally is pretty predictable in how it will hold the ink. This is a sheet as well, but it's very thick. It's 100% cotton. You just have to try and find out. But in my experience, quilting cottons are the way to go. And if you want to use a fabric from the front, but it has a print on it, turn it over and it tends to work really well. So as I have gotten freer with my quilt labels, I have started just using a raw piece of fabric and not turning under the edges or folding it over. I will do that corner one on the graduation quilt, but very often, like more often than not, I just use a plain piece of fabric. And I'll tell you why. The more I've thought about giving quilts and how long the quilt is going to be with the person, how long they're going to love it, and in talking to other quilters, a lot of times quilts that we give, they're beloved by the person that we give them to. But there may come a time that person passes on, or for whatever reason, that quilt is no longer in their company. It may find its way to the thrift store, to the Goodwill, to a family friend, or someone who values quilts. In my case, they're not going to know who Kathy Martin is. They don't care. They don't care that I made it October of 2024 or that I made it with love for Bonnie. They don't care. And so I like the idea of a quilt label that's been stitched down in such a way that if the future owner of this quilt has no interest in the quilt label, they can just take it off. And so to that end, I've done a couple of different stitches to hold them down. And for those of you that are wondering if I use interfacing, I don't. I really don't like fusible interfacing because it makes the fabric stiff. It's great for the ink, but it doesn't feel good like the rest of the quilt. I also don't like fusing the label to the quilt for this reason. If there comes a time that someone doesn't want that label on there anymore, too bad, so sad. And I don't really 100% buy into every single quilt has to have a label. The quilts that I've made for myself, aside from the first one, don't have labels. So if you're like, ugh, don't feel bad. I mean, it doesn't have to have a label. It's nice. And if it becomes a family heirloom, you have that history along with it. You know, I've given baby quilts to coworkers, and the reason I didn't put the quilt label on it is my relationship is with the coworker, not that baby. And if they love it and it becomes like Linus, is it Linus that carries it? Yeah, Linus from Charlie Brown that carries his blanket around everywhere. If that baby blanket, that baby quilt becomes their treasured thing, again, they don't know who Kathy Martin is and don't care. I don't need that in order for them to love their baby quilt. So I do understand, you know, the purpose and meaning. And if it does become an heirloom, a family heirloom, it's kind of nice to have that history. But sometimes a quilt label is not required. So now back to our regularly scheduled programming. I just stitched down a raw piece of fabric using one of two methods. I either use a blanket stitch, which is just, you know, right along the edge, and then it makes a little T, a little perpendicular T all around the edge and finishes out. Or I do the equivalent of just like my own zigzag. So it's like I make cross stitches all along the edge. Sometimes it looks a little rustic. Sometimes it looks a little better than others. And I'm learning as I go. Maybe this is a future video about how I'm learning to perfect my blanket stitch. But it is the sort of thing that it washes up fine. It holds the edges down, which is the purpose, and just gives that quilt label a little anchor, but it retains its softness and drape. So it's not this, you know, stiff, hard thing that's on the back that kind of gets in the way. I guess it's a whole evolution of quilt labels. It'll be interesting to see what kind of quilt labels I do 3 years from now, if I do them at all. Either I'll be even better with my blanket and cross stitch, or I'll just be like, I just put binding on it and call it a day. So anyway, that's how I make my quilt labels and where I started and where I am now. I hope you've enjoyed being along with me today. I'm Kathy Martin. This is the Catbird Quilts. Thanks so much for watching.